By the end of World War II, the United States had commissioned 147 aircraft carriers, more than the rest of the world combined at that time. But not every carrier pulled its weight. Some were compromised by design. Others arrived too late to matter. A few spent the war in roles so far from combat that calling them warships stretches the definition. This video ranks the U.S. carriers that contributed the least to winning the Pacific War. We're examining cold strategic value, combat impact, operational tempo, and design fitness. Did the carrier participate in major battles? Did it inflict significant damage on the enemy? Could it keep pace with the fleet and survive under fire? To understand failure, we first define success. USS Enterprise, CV-6, is the gold standard. She fought in nearly every major Pacific battle, from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa. At Midway, her air group sank 3 Japanese carriers. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any warship in American history. The Essex-class carriers set the standard for design. They displaced 27,000 tons, carried 100 aircraft, reached 33 knots, and had armor sufficient to survive bomb and torpedo hits. 17 Essex-class carriers were commissioned during the war. 0 were lost to enemy action. Against these benchmarks, we can identify the carriers that failed. Our evaluation framework tests combat, impact, operational tempo, and design fitness. Ships that pass all 3 were useful. Ships that fail multiple criteria are the subject of this ranking. We're looking for carriers that absorbed time, steel, and manpower but delivered minimal return on investment. By the end, one ship will stand as the most useless American carrier of World War II, a vessel that combined design failure, operational mediocrity, and strategic waste into a single monument to misallocated resources. The metrics of failure. Combat impact is measured by participation in major fleet actions. Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. These battles determined who controlled the Pacific. A carrier whose aircraft sank enemy warships, destroyed aircraft, and enabled strategic victories has high combat impact. A carrier that spent the war in secondary theaters or arrived after major battles concluded has low combat impact. Enterprise participated in virtually every decisive battle. Her dive bombers sank 3 Japanese carriers at Midway. During the Guadalcanal campaign, she was the only operational U.S. carrier in the South Pacific for an entire month. Her air group destroyed 911 enemy aircraft and sank 71 ships. That's the standard. Operational tempo measures sustained combat presence. Enterprise was operational for nearly 4 years of continuous combat. She launched thousands of sorties, took multiple hits, returned for repairs, and came back fighting. A carrier that took damage but survived and returned demonstrates value. A carrier sunk on its first major patrol or sidelined for extended periods represents lost capability. Design fitness determines whether the carrier was built for the war it fought. Could it operate modern aircraft F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, TBF Avengers? Could it keep pace with fast carrier task forces operating at 30 knots? Was it equipped with armor, compartmentalization, and fire suppression systems to survive damage? The Yorktown class demonstrated good design fitness. Yorktown survived 2 torpedoes and multiple bombs at Coral Sea, returned to Pearl Harbor, and fought at Midway. That's survivability translating into sustained combat power. Carriers without these features died quickly when hit. Ships that score high on all 3 criteria were useful. Ships that fail multiple criteria are useless. The carriers examined in this video failed in different ways, some through poor design, some through bad timing, some through fundamental misallocation of resources. The standard of success. To judge the worst, we must first understand the best. USS Enterprise, CV-6, represents the ultimate example of carrier effectiveness. Her record provides the benchmark against which all others are measured. Enterprise was a Yorktown-class fleet carrier commissioned in 1938. She displaced 20,000 tons, carried 90 aircraft, and could make 32 knots. Her protection included a 2.5 to 4-inch armored belt, armored hangar deck, and extensive compartmentalization. She was not the largest or most advanced carrier in the fleet, but she was present when it mattered most, and she survived when others didn't. Enterprise was at sea delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island on the 7th of December 1941 when Japan struck Pearl Harbor. Her aircraft arrived over Oahu during the attack. From that moment, she was in constant action. In early 1942, she conducted hit-and-run raids on Japanese-held islands in the Marshalls and Gilberts when the Navy had little else to offer. In April, she escorted USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid, providing fighter cover while Hornet launched Army B-25 bombers against Tokyo. At Midway in June 1942, Enterprise delivered the decisive blow. Her dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet at the critical moment and sank the carriers Kaga and Akagi. Later that day, they returned and sank Hiryu. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway fell to aircraft from Enterprise. This single action turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Guadalcanal campaign tested her endurance. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, she took 3 bomb hits but remained operational. At Santa Cruz in October, she was hit by 2 bombs and suffered damage from a crashed aircraft. Hornet was sunk in that battle. Enterprise survived. With Saratoga under repair and Hornet gone, Enterprise became the only operational American fleet carrier in the Pacific for 1 month in November 1942. Her air group flew continuous missions supporting the Marines on Guadalcanal, intercepting Japanese air raids, and striking Japanese shipping. If Enterprise had been sunk during this period, the strategic situation would have become untenable. She returned to action in 1943 and participated in nearly every major operation of the Central Pacific Campaign. The Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the strike on Truk Lagoon, the Marianas, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where she was one of 15 carriers that destroyed Japanese naval aviation, Leyte Gulf, where she participated in the destruction of the last Japanese carrier force, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. In May 1945, off Okinawa, she was hit by a kamikaze. The impact killed 14 men and caused significant damage. This final hit put her out of the war. She returned to the United States for repairs that were still ongoing when Japan surrendered. Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, the most of any U.S. warship in World War II. She sank 71 enemy ships and destroyed 911 aircraft. She received the first Presidential Unit Citation ever awarded to an aircraft carrier. Her nicknames, the Big E, the Lucky E, the Grey Ghost, became legendary. Sailors across the fleet knew that if Enterprise was in the fight, the Americans had a chance. This is what useful looks like: high combat impact, sustained operational tempo, and design fitness that allowed the ship to survive multiple hits and keep fighting. Enterprise was the right ship at the right time repeatedly. Now we examine the carriers that failed to meet this standard. The Sangamon Paradox, Overbuilt and Underutilized. The 4 ships of the Sangamon class, USS Sangamon, USS Suwannee, USS Chenango, and USS Santee, occupy a strange middle ground. They were converted from Cimarron-class fleet oilers, making them larger, faster, and more durable than the mass-produced escort carriers that would follow. They could carry around 30 aircraft. They saw significant action in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Yet they represent a fundamental misallocation of resources. The Sangamon was converted in 1942 when the U.S. Navy was desperate for carriers after the losses of Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet. The Cimarron-class oilers were large, well-built ships with excellent range and seakeeping. Converting them to carriers was faster than building new escort carriers from scratch. 4 oilers, Sangamon, Suwannee, Chenango, and Santee, were pulled from service and modified. A flight deck was installed over the hull. Minimal hangar space was added. Aircraft elevators and catapults were fitted. By late 1942, all 4 were commissioned as CVE's escort carriers. The ships had clear advantages over standard escort carriers. Their oiler origins gave them exceptional endurance. They could steam for weeks without refueling, making them ideal for long-range operations. At 24,000 tons, they were larger than most escorts. They could make 18 knots, which was fast for an escort carrier. They were more survivable than the cheap Casablanca-class carriers that followed, with better compartmentalization and hull integrity. But these advantages came with a critical drawback: opportunity cost. The Pacific Fleet was not limited by carrier availability. It was limited by fuel availability. Fast carrier task forces consumed enormous quantities of oil. Fleet oilers determined how long the task force could operate at sea. The 4 Sangamons, operating as oilers, could have sustained the fleet for years. As carriers, they performed missions that cheaper, simpler ships could do just as well. The core problem was speed. 18 knots was too slow for fleet operations. The fast carrier task force operated at 25 to 30 knots, with the ability to sprint at 33 knots. The Sangamons couldn't keep up. They were immediately relegated to secondary roles, escorting convoys, providing air cover for amphibious invasions, and conducting anti-submarine patrols. These were important missions, but they didn't require premium oiler hulls. The Casablanca-class escort carriers, built on simple merchant ship hulls, could perform the same roles. 50 Casablancas were built between 1942 and 1944, using assembly line techniques. They cost less, they were produced faster, they carried similar numbers of aircraft. They were slower and less durable than the Sangamons, but for escort and amphibious support work, that didn't matter. The missions didn't require 18-knot speed or extended endurance. They required a flight deck and some aircraft. The Sangamons saw extensive service. All 4 participated in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, providing air support for the landings. They transferred to the Pacific in 1943 and operated during the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas, and Philippines campaigns. At the Battle of Samar in October 1944, they were part of Taffy 3, the escort carrier group that faced the Japanese center force. Sangamon was damaged by a kamikaze but survived. Suwannee took a kamikaze hit and a torpedo from a submarine but remained operational. Santee was hit by a kamikaze and torpedoed, yet stayed afloat. Their crews fought bravely, but the question remains: would the war effort have been better served if these 4 ships had remained oilers? The answer is yes. The fast carrier task force was constantly limited by fuel. Carriers would launch strikes, then withdraw to rendezvous with oilers for refueling. This process took hours and left the task force vulnerable. More oilers meant more frequent refueling, which meant more time on station and more strikes against Japanese positions. The Sangamons represent efficiency failure. They fought for 3 years and contributed to operations, but they were the wrong ships for the job. High-quality oiler hulls were converted into adequate carriers when purpose-built, and cheaper carriers could do the same work. The opportunity cost 4 fleet oilers lost exceeded the benefit of 4 escort carriers gained. They were not useless in an absolute sense, but they were inefficient, and in a total war where resources determine outcomes, inefficiency is a form of failure. USS Wasp, doomed from the blueprint. USS Wasp, CV-7, was a wartime liability. Built under Washington Naval Treaty constraints, she was compromised from the moment her keel was laid. The Navy had 15,000 tons of carrier tonnage remaining under the treaty limits. They chose to use it to build one more carrier rather than leave it unused. The result was a scaled-down, fatally flawed ship. Wasp was commissioned in April 1940. She displaced 14,700 tons, carried 76 aircraft, and could make 29.5 knots. On paper, she looked like a smaller version of the successful Yorktown class. In practice, she was a death trap. To fit within tonnage limits, weight was cut everywhere, armor was minimal. Most critically, the ship had virtually no torpedo protection, no anti-torpedo bulges, no layered compartments are designed to absorb and contain flooding. The internal structure was thin-skinned and vulnerable. The Navy knew the ship was compromised. They built her anyway because treaty logic dictated using available tonnage rather than forfeiting it. This decision would cost the fleet dearly. Wasp spent her first 2 years in the Atlantic. She conducted neutrality patrols before the U.S. entered the war. After Pearl Harbor, her most notable missions were ferrying RAF Spitfires to the besieged island of Malta. She made 2 club runs in March and April 1942, launching Spitfires that flew to Malta to reinforce the island's defenses. These were critical missions for the Allied war effort in the Mediterranean, but they were on transport duty, not combat. Wasp was a delivery platform, not a strike carrier. In June 1942, with the carrier situation desperate in the Pacific, Wasp was transferred. She arrived too late for the Battle of Midway, the most decisive carrier engagement of the war. She was immediately thrown into the Guadalcanal campaign, providing air cover for the Marine landings in August. Her air group performed adequately, flying strikes against Japanese positions and combat air patrol over the invasion fleet. On the 15th of September 1942, Wasp was operating southeast of Guadalcanal as part of a carrier task force escorting transports. Japanese submarine I-19 spotted the force and maneuvered into attack position. The submarine fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 hit Wasp. 1 struck the forward section, rupturing aviation fuel tanks. Another hit amidships, destroying the electrical system. The 3rd hit aft, flooding the engineering spaces. The lack of torpedo protection was immediately evident. The torpedoes punched straight through the thin hull into vital spaces. Fires erupted throughout the ship as ruptured fuel lines fed the flames. Electrical power failed, cutting pumps and fire suppression systems. Secondary explosions tore through the hangar deck as ammunition cooked off. The crew fought desperately to contain the damage, but the ship's design worked against them. Without compartmentalization, flooding spread uncontrollably. Without intact electrical systems, damage control equipment was useless. Within an hour, fires were out of control. The order was given to abandon ship. 193 men died. The destroyer USS Lansdowne came alongside and took off survivors. American destroyers attempted to scuttle the hulk to prevent capture, firing torpedoes and hundreds of 5-inch shells into the burning wreck. Wasp finally sank that evening, 14 months after commissioning. Compare this to USS Yorktown at the Battle of Coral Sea 3 months earlier. Yorktown was a properly designed carrier with torpedo protection systems. She took 2 torpedoes from Japanese aircraft and multiple bomb hits. The torpedo protection absorbed much of the blast. Compartmentalization contained the flooding. Damage control parties extinguished fires and restored power. Yorktown made it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power. She was repaired in 3 days' work that should have taken 3 months and fought at Midway, where she finally went down after absorbing additional torpedo and bomb hits over 2 days of battle. The difference was design. Yorktown had the protection systems necessary to survive combat. Wasp did not. Treaty constraints forced the Navy to choose between building a properly protected carrier on more tonnage or building an inadequate carrier on the tonnage available. They chose the latter. That decision killed 193 men and cost the fleet a carrier at the worst possible moment. In mid-September 1942, the U.S. had 4 operational carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, Saratoga, and Wasp. Losing Wasp left 3. When Hornet was sunk at Santa Cruz 6 weeks later, and Enterprise was damaged, the Navy was left with one operational carrier, Enterprise alone for the entire Pacific theater for 1 month. If Enterprise had been sunk during that November 1942 gap, the strategic situation would have collapsed. Supply lines to Guadalcanal would have been cut. The Marines ashore would have been isolated. Wasp is a net negative contribution. She absorbed resources, steel, labor, shipyard time that could have gone elsewhere. A properly protected carrier built on more tonnage would have survived. An additional Essex-class carrier ordered earlier would have been in the fleet by late 1943. Instead, the Navy built a ship that lasted 3 months in the Pacific combat zone before being sunk because her design couldn't absorb damage. Treaty constraints were an excuse, not a justification. If the Navy couldn't build a survivable carrier on 15,000 tons, they should have built something else. A cruiser, a destroyer. Additional submarines. Anything that could contribute without getting sailors killed due to design flaws. Wasp represents catastrophic procurement failure, and her loss nearly cost the Navy the Guadalcanal campaign. The Lake Michigan Navy Wolverine and Sable. USS Wolverine and USS Sable were the strangest aircraft carriers in U.S. Navy history. They were not ocean-going warships. They were not designed for combat. They never left the Great Lakes. Yet they were designated aircraft carriers and played a role in the war effort. The question is whether that role makes them useful or whether their complete absence from combat makes them the most useless carriers ever commissioned. Both ships began life as side-wheel paddle steamers operating as passenger excursion vessels on the Great Lakes. USS Wolverine was originally the SS C&B, a luxury passenger steamer built in 1913. USS Sable was originally the SS Greater Buffalo, built in 1924. When the Navy needed platforms for carrier qualification training in 1942, these obsolete steamers were requisitioned and converted. The conversion was crude. A wooden flight deck was built over the hull, running 550 feet from bow to stern. There was no hangar deck, no aircraft elevators, no catapults, no arresting gear beyond basic cross-deck wires, no island superstructure, no defensive armament, no armor. The ships retained their paddle wheel propulsion, which gave them a top speed of about 18 knots, barely sufficient to generate wind over deck for light training aircraft. Their mission was singular: carrier qualification. Every naval aviator destined for the carrier fleet had to perform a series of takeoffs and landings on a moving deck to become certified. Before Wolverine and Sable, this training was conducted on fleet carriers operating off the coasts. That tied up valuable carriers and exposed them to risk. German U-boats operated off the East Coast in 1942, and a fleet carrier conducting training was vulnerable. Wolverine and Sable solved this problem. Operating on Lake Michigan, they provided a safe, submarine-free environment for training. The lake's relatively calm waters made it easier for inexperienced pilots to practice landings. The ships operated year-round, conducting thousands of qualification cycles. Between 1,942 and 1,945, over 17,000 naval aviators qualified on these two ships. Future President George H.W. Bush qualified on Sable in 1943. The strategic value was real. By providing a dedicated training platform, Wolverine and Sable freed fleet carriers to deploy to combat zones faster. Enterprise, Saratoga, and the new Essex-class carriers didn't have to spend months conducting training off California or Norfolk. They could work up their air groups using land-based training, then deploy directly to the Pacific. The Great Lakes carriers kept the pilot pipeline flowing without consuming combat carrier availability. But measured by combat effectiveness, Wolverine and Sable score absolute 0. They never left Lake Michigan. They never entered a combat zone. They never launched a combat sortie. They never faced an enemy aircraft or submarine. They operated in the safest possible environment, protected by thousands of miles of American territory. A single German or Japanese aircraft reaching Lake Michigan would have been a strategic catastrophe. So unlikely it wasn't even planned for. The ships themselves were not combat capable. They had no weapons to defend themselves, no armor to survive a hit, no damage control systems to contain fires or flooding. They were essentially floating docks with flight decks bolted on top. If they had somehow encountered an enemy submarine or aircraft, they would have been sunk immediately with no ability to resist. Their aircraft capacity was minimal. Because they had no hangars, aircraft had to be craned off the deck if they were damaged and couldn't take off again. The ships could handle a few aircraft at a time for qualification cycles, but they couldn't conduct actual carrier operations launching and recovering full air groups, rearming and refueling aircraft, and maintaining high sortie rates. The comparison to real carriers is stark. Enterprise launched strikes of 50 to 60 aircraft that flew hundreds of miles to attack Japanese ships and airfields. Wolverine launched one aircraft at a time, which flew in a circle around Lake Michigan and landed again. Enterprise faced kamikaze, bombs, and torpedoes. Wolverine faced weather. And even the weather on Lake Michigan was benign compared to Pacific typhoons. The argument for their usefulness rests entirely on their training contribution. They were essential infrastructure in the pilot production pipeline. But infrastructure is not the same as a weapon. A flight school is essential to producing pilots, but the flight school itself doesn't win battles. Wolverine and Sable were flying in flight schools. They produced combat-ready pilots, but they weren't combat vessels themselves. The question is whether we should judge them by what they enabled or by what they did. If we judge by enablement, they were critically important, no pilots, no carrier operations. If we judge by direct combat contribution, they were completely useless. This ranking is judged by direct combat contribution. By that measure, Wolverine and Sable are among the most useless carriers ever commissioned. They never fought. They were never designed to fight. They existed in a category separate from combat vessels. They were training equipment shaped like carriers, not carriers shaped for combat. The Latecomers carriers without a war. The industrial might of the United States was so immense that by 1945, carriers were being launched faster than the Navy could crew and deploy them. Many of these powerful, state-of-the-art vessels were completed so late that the war ended before they could make any meaningful contribution. They represent irrelevant excellence, perfect ships for a war that no longer existed. The late Essex-class carriers are the first category. The Essex class represented the pinnacle of World War II carrier design. They displaced 27,000 tons, carried 100 aircraft, reached 33 knots, and had armor sufficient to survive kamikaze hits. 17 were commissioned during the war and formed the core of the Fast Carrier Task Force, but several more were under construction when Japan surrendered. USS Oriskany, CV-34, was laid down in May 1944. Construction progressed through 1,945, but she was only partially complete when the war ended in August. With no immediate need for additional carriers, construction was suspended in 1946. She sat incomplete for 4 years. In 1950, with the outbreak of the Korean War, the Navy decided to complete her with an updated design, incorporating jet aircraft capability and an angled flight deck. She was finally commissioned in 1950, 5 years after World War II ended. She contributed nothing to the victory over Japan. USS Reprisal, CV-35, was laid down in 1944. Construction reached about 50% completion by August 1945. When Japan surrendered, the Navy cancelled her construction entirely. The incomplete hull sat in the shipyard for several years before being scrapped. Tens of thousands of tons of steel, thousands of man-hours of labor, and significant resources were sunk into a ship that was never completed. Those resources could have been used elsewhere: more landing craft, more bombers, more tanks, weapons that would have been in the fight in 1944 and 1945. Several other late Essex-class ships were commissioned in early to mid-1945, but saw minimal service before the war ended. USS Boxer, CV-21, was commissioned in April 1945. She conducted shakedown cruises and worked up her air group, but never reached the combat zone before Japan surrendered. USS Bon Homme Richard, CV-31, was commissioned in November 1944, but spent months in training before deploying to the Pacific. She arrived in time for the final operations off Okinawa and against the Japanese home islands, but her contribution was marginal. The war was already won. These ships went on to have long careers. Many served in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, but for World War II purposes, they were too late. The Essex-class carriers that mattered were the ones commissioned in 1943 and early 1000, 944 ships like Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Intrepid. These carriers fought from the Gilbert Islands through Okinawa, launching thousands of sorties and participating in every major operation. The late Essex-class ships arrived after the critical battles were over. The Midway class represents an even more extreme case. These were the ultimate evolution of World War II carrier design, incorporating every lesson learned from 4 years of combat. They were designed to be invulnerable. USS Midway, CV-41, displaced 45,000 tons, 50% larger than an Essex-class carrier. Her flight deck was armored with 3.5 inches of steel, sufficient to withstand heavy bombs and kamikaze impacts. The hangar deck was also armored. The underwater protection system was the most sophisticated ever fitted to a carrier, designed to absorb multiple torpedo hits. Anti-aircraft armament was immense: 18 5-inch guns, dozens of 40mm Bofors, and numerous 20mm Oerlikon cannons. She could carry over 130 aircraft, more than any other carrier afloat. She was commissioned on the 10th of September, 1945, 8 days after Japan signed the surrender documents aboard USS Missouri. Her first mission was not a combat operation. It was a peacetime deployment to demonstrate American naval power. She never launched a combat sortie against Japan. She never faced a kamikaze or submarine. The most powerful carrier ever built arrived too late to fight the war she was designed for. USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, CV-42, was commissioned in October 1945. USS Coral Sea, CV-43, followed in 1947. All 3 Midway-class ships went on to have long careers. Midway herself served 47 years, fought in Korea and Vietnam, and participated in Operation Desert Storm in 1991 before being decommissioned. She now serves as a museum ship in San Diego. But none of that changes the fact that for World War II, they were irrelevant. The resources used to build the Midway-class carriers were staggering. Each ship required over 40,000 tons of steel. Construction consumed millions of man-hours of labor. Entire shipyards were dedicated to building them for years. Those resources were locked into platforms that had no war to fight. Consider the alternative. The steel used to build USS Midway could have produced approximately 800 M4 Sherman tanks. Those tanks could have been in Europe in 1944, supporting the advance into Germany. Or the steel could have built 200 landing craft, enabling faster amphibious operations in the Pacific. Or 50 B-24 Liberator bombers, extending the strategic bombing campaign. All of these weapons would have been in action in 1944 and 1945, shortening the war and saving lives. Instead, the resources were used to build a carrier that was commissioned 8 days after the war ended. This is the definition of poor resource allocation. The ships themselves were excellent. The timing was catastrophic. The late arrivals represent a failure of strategic planning and prioritization. By 1944, it was clear the Allies were winning. Germany was being pushed back on all fronts. Japan was being systematically isolated and bombed. The need for additional carriers was diminishing, yet construction continued on ships that would not be ready in time to contribute. The industrial momentum was so great that it produced weapons that outlasted the war itself. These carriers rank among the most useless because they failed the timing test completely. A weapon that never fights has no value in the conflict it was built for. Perfect design arriving too late is worse than an adequate design arriving on time. The late Essex and Midway-class carriers were the former. USS Langley, CVL 27, the Retread name on a doomed ship. USS Langley, CVL 27, is not the original Langley. The first USS Langley, CV-1, was America's first aircraft carrier, converted from the collier Jupiter in 1922. That ship was an experimental platform that taught the Navy how to operate carriers. She was sunk in February 1942 while ferrying P-40 fighters to Java, her loss a footnote in the desperate early months of the Pacific War. The second USS Langley was an Independence-class light carrier, one of 9 Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls converted to carriers in 1942 to 1943. She inherited a proud name. She did not live up to it. Her career was marked by mediocrity, damage, and ultimately a betrayal that makes her unique among American carriers. She fought more battles for France than she ever did for the United States. The Independence-class carriers were an emergency measure. In early 1942, President Roosevelt noted that Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls were already under construction in significant numbers. Converting some of these hulls to carriers would be far faster than starting new carrier construction from scratch. The Navy's Bureau of Ships was skeptical. Cruiser hulls were long and narrow, poorly suited for flight deck operations. But with the crisis in the Pacific worsening, the decision was made. 9 Cleveland-class cruisers were pulled from the construction line and converted. The conversion was straightforward. Remove the cruiser superstructure and armament, install a flight deck and small island superstructure, and add minimal hangar space. The result was a light carrier that retained the speed and machinery of its cruiser origins, 31 knots, fast enough to operate with the fast carrier task force but with severe compromises. The cruiser hull was narrow, resulting in a flight deck only 3 feet wide at its narrowest point. For comparison, Essex-class flight decks were over 100 feet wide. Landing on a narrow pitching deck was one of the most hazardous operations in naval aviation. Pilots called the CVLs death traps, for good reason. The narrow hull also meant a cramped hangar deck with low overhead clearance. Aircraft capacity was limited to about 30 planes, 1/3 the capacity of a fleet carrier. Protection was minimal. Light cruiser armor, adequate against gunfire but insufficient against bombs or torpedoes. USS Langley, CVL 27, was commissioned in August 1943. She joined the Fast Carrier Task Force in the Central Pacific and participated in the island-hopping campaign. She was present at the invasion of the Marshall Islands in early 1944, conducting strikes against Japanese airfields and shore installations. She participated in the Marianas Campaign in mid-1944 and was at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, the engagement that destroyed Japanese naval aviation, but her contributions were consistently unremarkable. Other Independence-class carriers distinguished themselves. USS Princeton, CVL 23, fought aggressively throughout 1943 and 1944 before being lost heroically at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Princeton took a single bomb hit from a Japanese dive bomber. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, igniting fueled and armed aircraft. Fires reached the torpedo magazine, which detonated in a massive explosion. The ship was destroyed, but she died fighting, and her loss was mourned as a ship that gave everything. USS Monterey, CVL 26, and USS Cowpens, CVL 25, compiled solid combat records, their air groups participating in strikes against Japanese shipping and airfields throughout 1943 and 1944. Langley's record was tepid by comparison. She participated in operations but never stood out. Her air group scored no remarkable victories. Her presence in battles was noted but not celebrated. She was simply there, one carrier among many, contributing but not excelling. In October 1944, during the air battles off Formosa preceding the Leyte Gulf invasion, Langley was hit by a Japanese torpedo bomber. The torpedo was a dud or glanced off the hull without detonating. Luck, not design, saved her. The incident highlighted her vulnerability. A properly armed torpedo would have crippled or sunk her. In December 1944, Langley was caught in Typhoon Cobra, the devastating storm that struck the Third Fleet while operating east of the Philippines. The typhoon sank 3 destroyers USS Hull, USS Monaghan, and USS Spence, killing over 800 men. Multiple ships suffered damage. Langley's flight deck was buckled and damaged, rendering her non-operational. She was sent back to the United States for repairs. Other ships hit by Typhoon Cobra returned to combat. USS Monterey, also an Independence-class carrier, suffered severe damage, including fires in the hangar deck. Future President Gerald Ford, serving aboard Monterey as an officer, helped fight the fires. Monterey was repaired and returned to action for the Okinawa campaign. USS Cowpens was damaged but quickly repaired and fought through the end of the war. Langley did not return. She spent the final months of the war in repair and was never sent back to the Pacific. Her combat career effectively ended in December 1944, 5 months before the war ended. She had fought for 16 months, from August 1943 to December 1944. Compare that to other CVLs that fought continuously from their commissioning through Japan's surrender. After the war, Langley was decommissioned. The Navy had a surplus of carriers and no immediate need for all of them. Ships that had compiled distinguished records like Enterprise were nevertheless scrapped due to budget constraints. Ships with mediocre records like Langley were put into reserve or disposed of. In 1951, as part of the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, the United States transferred Langley to France. Renamed Lafayette R-96, the ship became a cornerstone of the post-war French Navy. She underwent refits to operate French aircraft and was immediately deployed to combat zones. From 1951 to 1963, Lafayette fought in 3 major conflicts. First came the Indochina War. France was fighting to maintain control of its colonial possessions in Southeast Asia against the Viet Minh, communist nationalist forces led by Ho Chi Minh. Lafayette operated in the Tonkin Gulf and South China Sea, her air group flying thousands of combat sorties. Her aircraft struck Viet Minh positions, interdicted supply lines, and provided close air support for French ground forces. During the siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the decisive battle that ended French control of Indochina, Lafayette's aircraft flew support missions, though the battle was ultimately lost. After French withdrawal from Indochina, Lafayette was deployed to the Mediterranean. In 1956, she participated in the Suez Crisis, the joint British-French-Israeli operation to seize control of the Suez Canal after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it. Lafayette's air group struck Egyptian airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and providing air cover for amphibious landings at Port Said. The operation was a military success but a political disaster, as international pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced Britain and France to withdraw. Finally, Lafayette fought in the Algerian War, the brutal conflict between France and Algerian independence fighters that lasted from 1954 to 1962. The ship operated off the Algerian coast, her aircraft conducting strikes against FLN positions in the mountains, interdicting supply routes from Tunisia and Morocco, and providing reconnaissance for French counterinsurgency operations. This was her longest sustained combat deployment, spanning years of continuous operations. Lafayette was finally decommissioned by France in 1963 and scrapped. She had served the French Navy for 12 years, participating in 3 wars and launching thousands of combat sorties. The contrast with her American service is stark. As USS Langley, She served 16 months in combat, from August 1943 to December 1944, participating in campaigns but never distinguishing herself before being damaged and sidelined. As Lafayette, she served 12 years, fighting in 3 major conflicts, and became one of the most active carriers in the French fleet. This is the ultimate failure. American taxpayers funded her construction. American shipyards built her. American sailors crewed her. American pilots trained to fly from her deck. The investment was entirely American, and after a brief, mediocre combat career, she was transferred to another nation, which then used her far more effectively and extensively than the United States ever did. The return on investment went to France, not America. The combat value she provided in Indochina, Suez, and Algeria was the combat value she didn't provide against Japan. The sorties her air group flew in the 1,950 seconds were sorties that could have been flown in 1945 if she hadn't been damaged and sidelined by Typhoon Cobra. No other American carrier of World War II shares this distinction. The Sangamons were scrapped after the war. Wasp was sunk. The Great Lakes carriers were scrapped. The late-war Essex and Midway-class ships went on to serve the U.S. Navy for decades. Midway fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. Even carriers that had mediocre records, like some of the other Independence-class ships, at least stayed in American service or were scrapped after contributing what they could. Only Langley was given away, and then fought someone else's wars more effectively than she fought America's war. That makes her unique. And it makes her a candidate for the most useless American carrier of World War II, not because she never fought, but because she fought better for France than for the United States. The investment was American. The benefit was French. That's the definition of a failed strategic asset. The comparative analysis, measuring the sins. We've examined 7 categories of failure. Now we need to measure them against each other to determine which represents the worst waste of resources. Each failed in different ways. Understanding the type and magnitude of failure is essential to ranking them. The Sangamons represent opportunity cost failure. They were functional ships that fought for 3 years and contributed to operations. All 4 survived the war. They performed escort and amphibious support missions adequately, but they were built on oiler hulls that were more valuable as oilers. The Pacific Fleet was fuel-limited, not carrier-limited. Fast carrier task forces could only operate as long as they had fuel. The oilers determined operational tempo. Converting 4 fleet oilers into slow escort carriers when cheaper, purpose-built Casablanca-class carriers could do the same job was inefficient. The Sangamons fought, but at the cost of what they should have been. USS Wasp represents a design failure. She was built under treaty constraints that stripped away survivability features. The result was a carrier that couldn't absorb damage. 3 torpedoes killed her in hours. A properly designed carrier like Yorktown survived worse and kept fighting. Wasp's design was fundamentally flawed. She lasted 14 months from commissioning to sinking, with only 3 months in the Pacific combat zone. Her loss came at the worst possible moment, leaving the Navy desperately short of carriers during the critical Guadalcanal campaign. She was a net negative. She absorbed resources and got sailors killed due to design flaws. The Great Lakes carriers represent categorical failure. They weren't combat ships. They were training platforms that operated in the safest possible environment. They never left Lake Michigan. They never faced an enemy. They had no combat capability whatsoever, no weapons, no armor, no ability to operate in open ocean. Measured as combat vessels, they score 0. Their value was in pilot training. But training infrastructure isn't the same as a weapon. A flight school produces pilots, but the school itself doesn't win battles. The late war carriers represent timing failure. Ships like USS Oriskany, USS Reprisal, and the entire Midway class were excellent designs that arrived too late. Midway was the most powerful carrier in the world when she commissioned, 8 days after Japan surrendered. The resources used to build these ships could have produced weapons that would have been in the fight in 1944 and 1945. Tanks, bombers, and landing craft all would have shortened the war. Instead, resources were locked into ships that never fought. Perfect design arriving too late is worse than an adequate design arriving on time. USS Langley represents investment betrayal. She had a mediocre combat record, participated in campaigns but never excelled. She was damaged and sidelined before the war ended. Then she was transferred to France and fought more effectively for another nation than she ever did for the United States. American investment, French benefit. That's unique among all U.S. carriers. Now we rank the magnitude of these failures. Which is worse? The Sangamons fought for 3 years and survived. Their failure was strategic inefficiency, not combat ineffectiveness. That's bad, but it's not catastrophic. They at least contributed. The Great Lakes carriers never fought at all, but they were never intended to fight. They were purpose-built training ships. Judging them as combat vessels is almost unfair. Their failure is categorical. They weren't weapons. The late war carriers were excellent ships that arrived too late. Their failure was timing, but they went on to serve the U.S. Navy for decades. Midway served 47 years. Their long-term value to America was real, even if their World War II contribution was zero. That leaves Wasp and Langley as the two worst candidates. Wasp failed catastrophically. Her design was flawed. She was sunk quickly due to those flaws. Her loss came at a critical moment when every carrier was irreplaceable. She was a net negative contribution. She cost more than she gave. Langley failed comprehensively. Mediocre combat record, inconsistent operational tempo, damaged and sidelined before the war ended, then transferred to another nation and used more effectively by them. She represents every type of failure: poor combat impact, low operational tempo, and ultimate strategic waste. The investment was American. The benefit was French. Between these two, which is worse? A carrier that tried to fight but died due to design flaws? Or a carrier that fought poorly, quit early, and then fought well for someone else? The inversion, what these failures teach us. Before we deliver the final verdict, we need to understand what these failures reveal about carrier effectiveness and strategic planning. The useless carriers weren't random accidents. They were the product of specific decisions and constraints. Understanding why they failed helps us understand what made the successful carriers work. Enterprise succeeded because it had the right balance of design, timing, and operational commitment. She was a Yorktown-class carrier, properly protected, fast enough for fleet operations, carrying a large air group. She was available when the war started. She was committed to continuous combat operations for nearly 4 years. Design plus timing plus operational tempo equals effectiveness. The Essex class succeeded for the same reasons. They were well-designed ships that arrived in large numbers at the right time, 1,943, when the Navy had regained its footing and was ready to go on the offensive. They operated continuously in the main effort against Japan. 17 commissioned during the war, 0 lost. That's the gold standard. The failures violated these principles in different ways. The Sangamons had adequate design and good timing, but were the wrong ships for the job. Their failure was strategic. They should have remained oilers. This teaches us that in warfare, opportunity cost matters as much as capability. A ship that performs its mission adequately but prevents another asset from performing a more valuable mission is still a net negative. Wasp had a terrible design. Treaty constraints forced the Navy to build an inadequate ship. This teaches us that artificial constraints like treaty tonnage limits can produce weapons that get people killed. If you can't build something that works within the constraints, don't build it at all. Build something else, or wait until the constraints change. The Great Lakes carriers had no combat design because they weren't meant for combat. This teaches us that categorization matters. A training ship is not a combat ship, even if both have flight decks. Calling Wolverine and Sable useless combat carriers is technically accurate but misses the point. They were never supposed to be combat carriers. The late war ships had excellent design but terrible timing. This teaches us that resource allocation must account for delivery timelines. Starting construction on a ship in 1944 that won't be ready until 1946 is wasteful if the war will be over by 1945. Resources should flow to weapons that will be in the fight when needed, not weapons that arrive after victory. Langley had mediocre design, participated in combat but underperformed, and was ultimately given away to another nation that used her better. This teaches us that strategic assets can be wasted not just by poor initial allocation, but by poor long-term management. Transferring a carrier to an ally might be good diplomacy, but it's a bad return on investment if that carrier then fights more effectively for the ally than it ever did for you. These lessons apply beyond carriers. Any weapon system can fail in these ways. Tanks that are too complex to maintain in field conditions. Aircraft that arrive after air superiority is already won. Ships built for the last war instead of the current one. The pattern repeats across military history. The successful weapons share common traits. They're designed for the mission they'll actually perform, they arrive when needed, and they're used continuously and effectively. Enterprise, the Essex class, the Casablanca-class escort carriers all succeeded because they met these criteria. The useless weapons violate at least one of these traits, often multiple, and in total war, where resources determine outcomes, useless weapons are worse than no weapons. They consume resources that could have been used elsewhere. They tie up shipyards, steel, and labor. They get sailors killed when poor design meets combat reality. Understanding these patterns allows us to identify the single worst failure. We're not looking for the carrier that tried and failed. We're looking for the carrier that failed comprehensively across multiple dimensions and added additional failures that no other ship shared. That carrier is USS Langley, CVL 27. The final ranking. From least to most useless. The evaluation is complete. Every candidate has been tested against our three criteria: combat impact, operational tempo, and design fitness. Now we rank them from least useless to most useless, building toward the carrier that represents the ultimate waste of American resources. Number 7. The Sangamon class dishonorable mention. Sangamon, Swanee, Chenango, and Santee rank 7th, which means they were the least useless of the useless. They fought for 3 years, participated in operations from North Africa to the Philippines, and all 4 survived the war. At the Battle of Samar, they faced Japanese battleships and cruisers and survived through a combination of their crew's courage and their ship's durability. But they represent strategic inefficiency. Converting fleet oilers into escort carriers consumed hulls the Pacific Fleet desperately needed as tankers. The fast carrier task force was fuel limited. Oilers determined how long the fleet could stay at sea. 4 Sangamons operating as oilers would have extended the task force's operational range and reduced refueling downtime. As carriers, they performed missions that cheaper Casablanca-class ships could handle equally well. Their failure was one of opportunity cost. They fought adequately, but they should have remained oilers. Resources were misallocated, even though the ships themselves performed acceptably. That's inefficiency, not catastrophe. They rank 7th because at least they contributed to operations, unlike the ships that follow. Number 6. The late Essex class incomplete at war's end. Ships like USS Oriskany, USS Reprisal, and other Essex-class carriers that were incomplete or barely operational when Japan surrendered rank 6th. These were excellent designs that simply came too late. Oriskany had her construction suspended in 1946 and wasn't commissioned until 1950. Reprisal was cancelled, half-built in 1945, and scrapped. Other late Essex-class ships were commissioned in early to mid-1945, but spent their time working up and training rather than fighting. By the time they were ready for combat, the war was over. The failure here is timing and resource allocation. The steel and labor used on these ships could have produced weapons that would have been used in the fight in 1944 and 1945. Instead, resources were locked into platforms that never fought in World War II. They rank 6th because their long-term value partially redeems them. Many late Essex-class ships served in Korea and Vietnam. They contributed to American naval power for decades. Their World War II contribution was 0, but their total contribution was significant. That's better than ships that contributed nothing ever. Number 5. The Midway class 8 days too late. USS Midway, USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, and USS Coral Sea rank 5th. These were the most powerful carriers ever built when they were commissioned. Midway displaced 45,000 tons, had an armored flight deck, carried over 130 aircraft, and was designed to be invulnerable to kamikazes and bombs. She was commissioned on the 10th of September 1945, 8 days after Japan surrendered. The failure is one of spectacular irrelevance, the ultimate weapon for a war that no longer existed. The resources used to build the Midway class could have produced hundreds of tanks, bombers, or landing craft for the 1,944-45 campaigns. Instead, they were locked into ships that had no war to fight. Like the late Essex class, the Midway-class ships redeemed themselves with long service. Midway fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm, serving 47 years before decommissioning in 1992. Her total contribution to American naval power was immense, but for World War II specifically, she was utterly useless. They rank 5th because their failure was purely temporal. The ships were perfect, the timing was catastrophic. That's better than ships with fundamental design flaws or operational failures. Number 4. The Great Lakes Carriers training ships, not warships. USS Wolverine and USS Sable rank 4th. They represent categorical failure. They were not combat ships. They were training platforms that operated exclusively on Lake Michigan in the safest possible environment. They qualified over 17,000 pilots, which gave them real strategic value, but measured as combat vessels, they score absolute 0. They never left the lake. They never faced an enemy. They had no combat capability, no weapons, no armor, no ability to operate in open ocean. They were floating runways, not warships. Their failure is definitional. They can't be useful combat carriers because they weren't built to be combat carriers. Judging them against Enterprise or Essex is like judging a cargo ship against a battleship. It's a category error. They rank 4th because their non-combat nature was intentional. They were purpose-built training ships. Their uselessness as combat vessels was by design, not accident. That's different from ships that were supposed to fight but couldn't. The top 3 all had the opportunity to contribute to combat and failed. Number 3. USS Wasp, CV, 7, the treaty victim. USS Wasp ranks 3rd. She represents catastrophic design failure. Built under Washington Naval Treaty constraints, she was stripped of torpedo protection and armor to meet tonnage limits. The result was a carrier that couldn't survive combat. She was commissioned in April 1940. She spent 2 years in the Atlantic, conducting patrols and ferrying aircraft to Malta. She transferred to the Pacific in June 1942, arrived too late for Midway, and participated in the Guadalcanal campaign. On the 15th of September 1942, 3 torpedoes from Japanese submarine I-19 hit her. The lack of torpedo protection was immediately evident. Fires spread uncontrollably. The ship was abandoned and sunk within hours. She lasted 14 months from commissioning to sinking, with only 3 months in the Pacific combat zone. Her loss came when the Navy could least afford it, September 1942, when carriers were irreplaceable. Within 6 weeks, Hornet was also sunk, leaving the Navy with only 2 operational carriers. If Enterprise had been lost during that period, the strategic situation would have collapsed. Wasp is a net negative contribution. She absorbed resources and got sailors killed due to design flaws. Treaty constraints were an excuse, not a justification. If the Navy couldn't build a survivable carrier on 15,000 tons, they should have built something else. She ranks 3rd because her failure, while catastrophic, was at least the result of trying to fight. She made it to the combat zone. Her crew did their duty. The ship just couldn't survive because its design was fundamentally flawed. That's better than a ship that never tried at all, but worse than a ship that tried, survived, and contributed over time. Number 2. USS Langley, CVL, 27. The ship that quit. USS Langley, CVL 27, ranks 2nd. She represents comprehensive operational failure, combined with strategic betrayal. Langley was an Independence-class light carrier commissioned in August 1943. She participated in the Marshall Islands, Marianas, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But her contributions were consistently mediocre compared to other Independence-class carriers. She was hit by a dud torpedo off Formosa in October 1944. She was damaged by Typhoon Cobra in December 1944 and sent back for repairs. She never returned to combat. Her combat career lasted 16 months, ending 5 months before the war was over. After the war, she was transferred to France. Renamed Lafayette, she fought in the Indochina War, the Suez Crisis, and the Algerian War from 1951 to 1963. She saw more combat, launched more sorties, and had greater strategic impact as a French carrier than she ever did as an American one. This is an investment betrayal. American taxpayers funded her construction. American sailors crewed her. And after a brief, mediocre combat career, she was given to another nation that used her far more effectively. The investment was American. The benefit was French. Langley ranks second because she combines multiple failures: a mediocre combat record, inconsistent operational tempo, premature departure from combat, and ultimate transfer to another nation. She's worse than Wasp because Wasp at least tried to fight until she was killed. Langley quit before the war ended. She's worse than the late arrivals because they at least went on to serve America for decades. Langley served France longer and better than she served the United States. Only one ship is worse. Number 1. The most useless. But first, a twist. The ranking is nearly complete. We've examined every major category of failure. Sangamons through Langley have been ranked. Each represents a different kind of uselessness. But there's one more candidate we haven't fully explored. A ship that combines the worst elements of multiple failures into a single platform. A carrier that was poorly designed, operationally limited, and ultimately contributed less than almost any other American carrier of the war. That ship is USS Ranger, CV-4. USS Ranger, the false economy. USS Ranger has been mentioned briefly, but deserves full examination because she represents perhaps the purest form of procurement failure in the entire U.S. carrier program. While other ships failed due to bad timing or bad luck, Ranger failed because the Navy made a conscious decision to prioritize quantity over quality, and got neither. Commissioned in 1934, Ranger was the first U.S. carrier designed and built as a carrier from the keel up. She wasn't a conversion like Lexington and Saratoga, or an experimental platform like Langley. She was supposed to be the template for future American carriers. Instead, she became a cautionary tale. The Washington Naval Treaty imposed strict tonnage limits on each nation's carrier fleet. The United States had a total allowance of 135,000 tons. Lexington and Saratoga consumed nearly 70,000 tons between them. That left about 65,000 tons for future construction. The Navy faced a choice: build a few large, capable carriers, or build several smaller, cheaper ones to maximize the number of hulls. They chose quantity. Ranger was designed to displace just 14,500 tons, barely more than half the size of Britain's contemporary carriers and a fraction of the Lexington class. The logic was that 3 or 4 small carriers could be built for the tonnage cost of 2 large ones, providing more flight decks and greater operational flexibility. The logic was fatally flawed. To fit within the tonnage limit, compromises were made everywhere. Ranger was slow only 29 knots compared to 33 knots for the Lexingtons. She was lightly armored, with minimal protection against bombs or torpedoes. Her flight deck was short at 769 feet, limiting aircraft operations. Most critically, her hangar deck had low overhead clearance, which meant she couldn't accommodate the larger, more powerful aircraft that were already entering service by the late 1932. By the time war came in 1941, Ranger was obsolete. She was too slow to operate with the fast carrier task forces. Her low hangar couldn't handle F-6F Hellcats or other modern aircraft. Her light protection made her vulnerable, The Navy quickly realized she was unfit for frontline duty in the Pacific. Instead, Ranger spent the war in the Atlantic. She conducted anti-submarine patrols, escorted convoys, and ferried aircraft to forward bases. These were important missions, but they were secondary theater operations. In November 1943, she participated in Operation Leader, launching strikes against German shipping off the coast of Norway. The raids inflicted modest damage on several vessels, but this was her only significant offensive action of the entire war. By mid-1944, even these limited duties were beyond her. She was withdrawn from active combat roles and reassigned as a training carrier, preparing new pilots stateside. She spent the final year of the war doing the same job that Wolverine and Sable did on Lake Michigan, qualifying pilots who would then go fight on real carriers. Ranger's failure was comprehensive. She had low combat impact, one minor operation in the Atlantic, no Pacific service. She had low operational tempo, most of her service was training and transport. Her design fitness was terrible, too slow, too lightly armed, unable to handle modern aircraft. But the worst part was the opportunity cost. Ranger consumed 14,500 tons of the Navy's carrier tonnage allotment under the treaty. That tonnage could have gone toward building a proper fleet carrier. If the Navy had used that tonnage to build another Yorktown-class ship, it would have had a carrier that could fight in the Pacific, carry modern aircraft, and survive damage. Instead, they got a ship that spent the war in secondary roles. The false economy, thinking that produced Ranger more ships of lower quality, was discredited by her failure. When the Navy designed the Yorktown class that followed, they rejected the small carrier concept entirely. The Yorktowns were proper fleet carriers, 20,000 tons, 32 knots, well protected, capable of carrying large air groups. They were everything Ranger wasn't. The question is whether Ranger ranks among the most useless carriers. She saw more service than some candidates on our list. She operated for the entire war, unlike Wasp, who was sunk in 1942. She at least contributed to operations in the Atlantic, unlike the Great Lakes carriers who never left their lake. But she represents pure procurement failure. She was built on flawed logic, quantity over quality, and the result was a ship that couldn't perform the primary mission of a fleet carrier. She consumed treaty tonnage that should have gone to a better ship, and she spent the war doing missions that didn't require a purpose-built carrier. Ranger deserves to be in the ranking. But where? Conclusion: the price of building wrong. The story of America's World War II carriers is not one of universal triumph. For every enterprise that carved its name into legend, there was a Wasp built with fatal flaws, a Ranger too compromised to fight the main battle, a Wolverine confined to a lake, a Midway that arrived after the party was over, and a Langley that ultimately fought someone else's wars. These useless carriers are not a mark of shame on the crews who served them. The sailors who manned Wasp fought as bravely as those on Enterprise. The pilots who qualified on Wolverine and Sable were just as skilled as those who flew from Yorktown. The men who crewed Langley through typhoons and combat had no control over the strategic decisions that wasted their ship. The failure was not in courage or competence. The failure was in design, procurement, timing, and strategic planning. Each category of failure teaches a different lesson. The Sangamons demonstrate that resource allocation matters. Converting premium oiler hulls into adequate carriers when the fleet needed those oilers more was inefficient. Building the right thing matters as much as building something. USS Ranger proves that false economy, building cheaper ships to maximize numbers, produces weapons that can't perform their mission. Better to have fewer capable ships than more inadequate ones. USS Wasp shows that design constraints can kill. Treaty tonnage limits forced the Navy to build a carrier without survivability features. The result was a ship that lasted 3 months in combat before dying because 3 torpedoes punched through her unprotected hull. Artificial constraints that produce inadequate weapons are worse than no weapons at all. The Great Lakes carriers reveal that categorization matters. A training ship is not a combat ship, even if both have flight decks. Confusing infrastructure with weapons leads to misunderstanding their value. The late arrivals, both Essex class and Midway class, demonstrate that timing is critical. The most powerful carrier in the world, commissioned 8 days after Japan surrendered, is useless for winning that war, no matter how perfect the design. Resources should flow to weapons that will be in the fight when needed. And USS Langley represents the ultimate failure, investment betrayal. A carrier that served another nation more effectively than it served the country that built it is a complete write-off of strategic value. These failures were not inevitable. They were the product of specific decisions made under specific pressures, treaty constraints, industrial capacity, strategic miscalculation, budget priorities, lack of combat experience. Each flawed carrier can be traced back to a decision point where different choices would have produced different outcomes. The successful carriers, Enterprise, the Essex class, even the escort carriers that won the Battle of the Atlantic, succeeded because they avoided these pitfalls. They were designed for the mission they would actually perform. They arrived when they were needed. They were used continuously and effectively. They balanced capability with production speed, protection with striking power, and individual quality with fleet quantity. The distance between success and failure in carrier design was measured in inches of armor, knots of speed, and months of delivery time. A Yorktown-class carrier had torpedo protection. Wasp did not. That difference meant Yorktown survived Coral Sea and fought at Midway, while Wasp died in hours. An Essex-class carrier commissioned in 1943 fought for 2 years and survived. A Midway-class carrier commissioned in 1945 never fired a shot in World War II. That difference was timing. In the crucible of total war, there is a vast difference between existing and mattering. The carriers ranked in this video existed. They consumed resources. They occupied shipyards. They employed crews. They held hull numbers and commission dates. But they did not matter to the outcome of World War II. Some because they were poorly designed. Some because they came too late, some because they were used incorrectly, and one because it was given away to fight other wars. The final ranking stands as a cautionary tale in military procurement. At the bottom, the least useless are the Sangamons, which at least fought despite being the wrong ships for the job. Above them, the late Essex class and Midway class, excellent designs that arrived too late. Then, the Great Lakes carriers, which never fought because they were never meant to. USS Ranger, confined to secondary theaters because a false economy produced an inadequate ship. USS Wasp, killed by design flaws that should never have been accepted. And at the top, or rather the bottom, USS Langley, the carrier that fought poorly for America and well for France, representing the ultimate waste of strategic investment. The question this video posed was simple. Which U.S. aircraft carriers were the most useless in World War II? The answer is complex because uselessness takes many forms. But the lesson is clear. Building weapons is not enough. They must be the right weapons, built at the right time, designed for the right mission, and used correctly. Every carrier on this list failed at least one of these tests. Some failed all of them. The Navy learned these lessons. The supercarriers that followed the Forrestal class, the Kitty Hawk class, the nuclear-powered Enterprise, and the Nimitz class incorporated the hard-won knowledge of what worked and what didn't. Modern carriers are larger, faster, better protected, and more capable than anything that fought in World War II. They can operate for decades without refueling. They carry aircraft that can strike targets 1,000 miles away. They are mobile airfields that project American power across the globe. But their lineage traces back through the successes and failures of World War II. Enterprise taught the Navy what determination and good design could accomplish. The Essex class proved that mass production and quality could coexist. Wasp taught that compromised design gets people killed. Ranger showed that false economy produces false capability. And Langley, the second ship to bear that name, demonstrated that even ships that survive can be wasted if they're misused and then given away. The carriers that won the Pacific War did so not just through strength, but through being the right strength applied at the right time in the right way. The carriers that lost, or more accurately, that contributed almost nothing, failed because they were wrong in design, timing, or use. In total war, there is no room for inefficiency. no forgiveness for compromised designs, and no second chances for weapons that arrive too late. The most useless carriers of World War II serve as monuments not to the failure of American industry, which was overwhelming in its success, but to the eternal challenge of strategic planning, building the right thing, at the right time, for the right mission. Get it right, and you get Enterprise. Get it wrong, and you get the ships on this list. And while the story of tanks and planes tells another tale, the lesson remains the same. In war, only results matter, and these carriers, for all their steel and sacrifice, delivered results that ranged from marginal to non-existent. That is the measure by which history judges them, and by that measure, they were found wanting.